Om Brahmanandam Paramasukadam Kevalam Gyanamurtim Nondual Gagana Sadrasham Tatmama Shadilaksham Ekam Nityam Bimlamachalam Sarvadi Sakshi Bhutam Bhavatitam Triguna Rahitam Sadgurum Tan Namami. Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. We salute the leader of our souls, through whose grace our ignorance is dispelled, who is beyond good and bad, pleasure and pain, life and death, and all other pairs of opposites. We recognize that one as the only witness to the changing phenomena of this universe. May we, through that grace, go beyond darkness and delusion and realize the truth in this very life. Om, peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, may peace be unto all. Om, Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om Tat Sat. You are attending the fourth class of the month of Sundays series called Sri Ram's Discourse of Divine Discontent. And we're looking into the teachings that this avatar of the Treta Yuga delivered to us in ancient times. Who knows if the rebirth theory, or relative truth we like to call it in our religion, holds true. And maybe some of us were even in that court of King Dasaratha, or our relatives were, and we're giving ear to that young lad's great assessment of the vagaries and vicissitudes of Maya and the problems of life. Probably much like a Sermon on the Mount when everyone gathered to hear Jesus talk about the various problems. Birds have nests, foxes have holes, you have no place to lay your head here, kind of teaching that came from these great souls. Or in the time of Lord Buddha, when he had his nirvana and had to come out of silence and speak about Mara, all these changing name and form, time and space, cause and effect, equivalence and dualities that we come upon in our everyday life here in this present day, which is called the Kali Yuga, by the way, the present age. So we've been going through a whole list of these diatribes that this young man has been delivering to not only his father, the king, and the queens that are there, the priests, the people from the village, merchants, the guests who've come from out of country. They're all standing there in amazement as he goes through all of these things, like we looked at already with false superimposition and root ignorance and vasanas, desires, and abhimana, this false identification of the mind's attention on unreal things. Instead of it remaining true to that third eye vision, it's always looking through two eyes, hearing through two ears, and it believes what it hears and what it sees, what it feels, what it touches, what it smells. And transcending then the five elements and the five senses and the subtle senses, which we'll look at a little bit today, is an inward journey that beings take when they want to go towards a transcendent view of the truth, as I was just chanting about. Sakshi Bhutam, the witness of all phenomena. That's not just a single person out there or in there, but it's your own consciousness that needs to attain to that high level of detachment. And finally, renunciation, which these great souls attained and which we follow, and even in this day and age, by the great example of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa and Swami Vivekananda, the great Swami, who's a sannyasin, and came before us, even in this country in 1893 at the Parliament of Religions, to speak about this oldest order of world renouncers that he belonged to. And got a great applause from materialistic people, from intellectual people, simply by standing up and exuding and exemplifying this truth in well-chosen words that were a combination of wisdom and adoration for the Atman existing in all beings. That's what we want to see, Brahman, or that divine reality, in everything and everywhere. The last word in spiritual attainment on this earth, quote, Sri Ramakrishna, unquote, is to see Brahman here in everything. It doesn't mean as everything, because things are not Brahman, so you have to go into a little bit deeper level of what we called discrimination, viveka, to get rid of these problems like false superimposition. Ram's already read his diatribe, spoken out his heart to the people at the court about this. If you've been with me for all these classes, then you know. And we're taking examples from Yoga Vasishtha, which is this great scripture in which this story is held, of the young avatar being trained by Lord Vasishtha. And the two facets I'm presenting are after the pilgrimage that this young man has taken, he comes back very sober and then gives this discourse. What you need to do after that is go on reading the rest of Lord Vasishtha's book, Yoga Vasishtha, to find out how Vasishtha then trained this young lad to make him more and more aware of his avatarhood and bring out this internal wisdom that was transcendent of all the various things that Sri Ram saw on his pilgrimage. The most of which affected him was suffering of people. So he was very sensitive being, very sensitive to people's suffering, and had a great amount of compassion for that. And it affected him when he saw it, just like it did Buddha some thousands of years later. So India has always been this country that has had an eye towards both wisdom and devotion, and both transcendence and compassion, and both inaction and action, meditation and karma yoga, that is. These have always been assessed and gathered together in such a way as to bring forth what Vivekananda now calls the religion of this age, is the four yogas put together. That is Jnanam, Bhakti, Dhyanam, or Raja, meditation, and karma. And that's the yogas of wisdom, devotion, meditation, and selfless service that all of us are trying to put together, all of us who are devotees of the Lord and Mother of the Universe, who look at these great souls who came before us in every religion as being divine descents. They've come out of the divine into the human body like we have, and now they're standing there emulating the truth, speaking about it, passing on the teachings, transmitting the Dharma, and opening us up to this highest wisdom and telling us that it's already within us, you just need to awaken to it. And then once awakened, then you take it and put it into action. And all the four yogas find their consummation in that routine, you might say, of spiritual awakening. Everything leading toward that moment where the soul realizes itself as one with the divine. The Jivatman realizes that it is the Paramatman. So it's beautiful to have a soul that's veiled, a great soul that's veiled like Sri Ram in his teens, all of a sudden awaken amidst a vast amount of people. And that's going to make the greatest impression, that we figure that's the Divine Mother's intention for bringing avatars to this world and veiling them. The problem is that for a greater amount of people, they stay veiled. Even after they reveal this truth, nobody believes them. So it's up to us then to come behind these great souls, like the wake of a ship. You know, a great ship comes through the ocean of this world, leaves a wake behind it, and waves. And those beings are great ships. Sri Ramakrishna himself used that analogy. A log can take one or two people across a river, a canoe, a few more, a ferry boat, 30 or 40. But these steamliners, they can take hundreds and hundreds of people across the ocean of this world. That still doesn't mean there's still thousands and thousands left back on land. But may God speed to you in crossing over to this farthest shore, to the farthest shore beyond all darkness, is what the Svetashvatara Upanishad says about that. Svastivaha paraya tamasaha. Tamasaha is darkness. So that's why may we go beyond darkness and delusion, I just chanted, and realize the truth in this very life. This truth remains the same through all phases of time. So when we look back to Sri Ram's time, which is a very early age, thousands of years ago, we find him transmitting the very same truth with all its non-dual essences and all its facets to the people of that time who were more awake than we are, as the ages determine. They're still possessed of 2/3 of their spiritual remembrance. In the Kali Yuga, by then, you're supposed to have lost all of it, most people, which seems to me to be a fact when you look out on a vicious world that's still going to war, trying to hurt people instead of help them. And transgressing all sorts of dharmic laws, what to speak of moral laws, what to speak of even good sense, common sense, and adhering to these truth principles, which are found in every religion. But let's study it in our particular religion, the Sanatana Dharma. We call it the eternal religion, and pick up where we left off in class 3. I didn't mean to leave you hanging, but I looked back a little bit on class 3 on the recording and saw that I had shown you the Uddalaka story in accordance with Abhimana, false identification. And we were seeing that I didn't fill in the final echelon of his journey inward, so I didn't want to leave you hanging for that. So let's pick that up. Remember, as you see by the chart here, he decided to reach the final destination because he'd made several attempts, like sort of making an attempt at that fortress gate and being thrown back again and again. Finally, he wanted those gates to open and he wanted to attain what you see there at the top of the chart, Nirvikalpa Samadhi and Vedanta, this highest state of consciousness. So he finally determined he would do this by hook or by crook, if you want to say. And there we started at the bottom. He reasoned with the mind. He practiced, I am not this, with all of the things that were there in front of his eyes and his senses. He fixed his body in a still position, ekasana, just one asana, focused the mind inward. He controlled the 5 pranas. We'll look at those next. He separated the senses from their objects. The Indriyas named after Indra, the lord of the senses, at least to a certain level. So basically the Indriyas are little gods, is what that means. And the senses all have this power of the divine in them. Gives them the power to see, the power to taste, the power to hear. Then he closed the 9 gates of the body. If you count the apertures of the body, you'll find 9. And the Purusa is that one who's sitting there in that castle of 9 gates, is sometimes how they explain that. That's your soul taken on this body-mind mechanism with these senses in this world of 5 elements, and trying not to be swayed by any of it, just existing, coexisting with it, and also practicing that transcendence of changing things, which got the people of every age in trouble. See, by false identification and by rude ignorance and by false superimposition, falling for the wool pulled over your eyes trick, which Maya is very good at doing. So inside the 9 gates of the body, he fastened the mind in the heart, made akendra, that's a good word in Sanskrit. He simulated death by stopping his breathing. We already said that. By controlling the 5 pranas. He reached sankalpa vinashana. That is, he was able to destroy his mind's thought forms. All of these things that he did up to that point, that dotted lines where we stopped, and then we talked a little bit about the ultimate at the end of that class last time. all of these things that he did to get him to Vivek again, people are trying to do now without completing the picture. They think I can just destroy my thoughts, and they may practice a year, 5, 10, and the thoughts are still insinuating themselves upon them. Thoughts mean thoughts of objects. If you could get to a place where your thoughts were thoughts of something else other than objects, then that would be a next level of a lower samadhi, as yoga teaches, that is, Patanjali teaches. And then you get to a place where there's neither thought nor object. And then you're finding out at that time that there's a witness to the thoughts and the objects both. And it's not just the mind, because the mind has been, and its thoughts have been turned off. We'll get to that soon when he talks about manas, deha, and ahamkara, ego. And we might even be able to get to that today. So just stopping there to let you know that people are trying to turn off their thoughts and not having a lot of success in it. But he did. He penetrated through, and he began to discriminate away avidya, the root avidya in his Ajnana. We looked at that already in Ron's discourse on it. And he attained viveka again. That is that knowledge of discrimination between the real and the unreal. Then the light showed itself up to him. This is what we did cover last week. The light showed itself up to him, and he had to try and merge, like a hailstone in an ocean, or Sri Ramakrishna said, like a salt doll walking into an ocean. It still wanted to keep its form, but it couldn't. It began to melt away in the very essence that its form was made of. So that was this tendency, this great light, and how to become stable in it. So there's a certain kind of incapacity or imbalance. I remember talking about it last time in terms of misorientation, when consciousness gets too deep and you haven't satisfied these criteria. And this is why some people are having premature Kundalini awakenings. Sri Ramakrishna said it comes up to a certain degree and it comes plummeting back down the next day because it didn't have any station to maintain its level of attainment. So it's in a flash of experience that could be called a good thing, but could also have risks to it, because there are both poisons and nectars in the 7 lotuses, or at least in 6 of them. So this disorientation is the one that he's coming up against here and seeing the light, Brahma Jyoti. Then he mastered the tendency towards sleep or unconsciousness. Like if you approach the great light, it would be so intense that you just want to sort of fall asleep to it. Guess what that's called, everyone? Deep sleep, or sushupti. That's been listed in the Nondual teachings of Advaita Vedanta and studied quite a bit. So if you come upon a great light, it's just so intense. It's like coming near a bonfire. You just want to cuddle up and get warm near it, but you don't ever get close to it or go into it, to dissolve name and form completely, to burn out the seeds that cause rebirth and other problems. So that's by way of saying Swapnajaya is getting victory over dreaming and sleeping, deep sleep, and being comfortable and not falling asleep at the same time in this high state of awareness. And then he reached the highest place, uncovered the primal moha and dispersed its darkness. So that's this mula vidya, they call it. Here it's called moha vinashana because he's destroying moha, delusion in the mind. This is at a very high level of delusion, like at the high level of cosmic consciousness. Then we did skip a little bit ahead and talk about that. To attain nirvikalpa samadhi. If you look up the left-hand side of the chart, you can see the whole thing starts with sadhana, and everything that he did to attain is below the dotted line. That's Udalaka. And then Udalaka got to Savikalpa samadhi and began to use his sadhana to gain things like a vision of the light and discrimination between the real and the unreal and victory over sleep. It's very beautiful, isn't it? And all these things are things you might have heard about or read about if you're familiar with the Indian scriptures, Gita, Upanishad, so forth. But now you see it put in a certain order that an individual who's trying very hard to attain moksha or mukti is actually putting into place. So all of that he's doing there when he gets to Viveka Jnana and onward is a Salvikalpa samadhi state. It's a seeded kind of samadhi. There are still seeds in it, obviously, because you're still having to do some purifications there. But when it comes to Nirvikalpa, the goal has been reached. And there you see that there's even a return to Nirvikalpa. Return from Nirvikalpa, it says. Refuse the occult powers, transcend heavenly existence, and reject personal lordship. And I went through that a little bit in that last class. So this is from the story of Uddalaka in Yoga Vasishtha. And this is a story that Vasishtha has pulled out of the whole collection of stories of India to give to the young Ram after this has already been delivered. So these were days later, as it were, when he took him under his wing and said, you've spoken wisdom, now here, let me give you some teachings from the tradition that'll allow you to get rid of this maya in your mind, this sense that suffering's real, the sense that dualities are real, the sense that transcendence of suffering is somehow not possible. See, that's one of the directives of yoga is you get to the first 7 stages of attainment in yoga, and one of them is transcending suffering for all time. So this becomes not just a possibility, but something that's gained and earned when you go the full distance with it. What do you get there? Freedom from mental thought forms. You're not putting yourself into bodies anymore in ignorance. Transcendence of visible things. So the inward worlds have become known to you. The outer world fades away. As Sri Ramakrishna said, the further you go towards Brahman, the further away you go from the world. So if you get into this non-dual state, this nirvikalpa state, this nirvana state, this asampragyata state, as Patanjali called it, siddha state, then this is what occurs to the consciousness there. Ability to merge with Atman and transcends both Jivan Mukti and Videha Mukti. That is, both living liberated state and freedom from bodies. And attains to Sata Samanya. And this is a great secret of Lord Vasishtha's yoga. This is what he would add to that collection of great words like nirvana, nirvikalpa, asampragyata, moksha, mukti, kaivalya. Now you got to add another one in there, Sata Samanya. That's Lord Vasishtha's way of explaining to you the highest state plus everything that you get when you attain it, everything that occurs there. So we'll run through that real quick to warm us up, and now let's go on to the next entry on the chart. That is our main chart of study. And background picture there is Ram and Sita and Lakshmana in the court. They've come back, in this picture, they've come back from exile, though. This isn't when they're giving the great talk or the great diatribe. But basically the next thing he talks about is prana, or life force. He has a bone to pick about it. We've often talked about prana as that life force which is the most addictive substance in the world. Maybe in the 3 worlds, if you take the 3 worlds to be humans, the elementals and the ancestors. In this Kala chakra loop, if you're talking about these 3 worlds, the 3 lower chakras worlds, then prana is what's moving everything. I mean, prana is Shakti's power, but the Shakti hasn't been uncovered yet, and the prana has been seized upon as being real. It's sort of like here in the world that we're seizing upon nature as being real when the Purusha, our soul, is real. In that same way, in these other 2 worlds, which are the 3 lower worlds, they're seizing upon prana to be real, and they're using it to gain things. So that's why we call prana in the three worlds the most addictive substance. You wouldn't enjoy food, for instance, if the food were the thing that you enjoy the most, if prana wasn't in the tongue and in the food. So people get addicted to food, or people get addicted to wealth, gold, silver. That's all also in the world, and it's under the auspice of prana. People get addicted to the intellect, thoughts. That's flowing by prana. We'll show you that soon. In fact, I can show it to you now that we've broached this particular subject. But here, let's look at what Ram says, because I've been reading straight out of the scripture to you about these very things that he transmits teachings about. Here's what he says about prana to the court. Another problem in Maya that has struck me and sobered me in the presence of desire is the presence of desire and the connection with life force and disease. It is like a diamond-pointed sword that penetrates everything in life and mind, spending their life and its essential energy called prana on vexing pursuits that deplete rather than restore vital energy. Called prana, beings open themselves up for all manner of disease to manifest, rising up from bitter seeds that are lying fallow in the mind from previous existences. One sentence: rebirth, what causes it, desire, what you get when you're reborn, suffering, and how it's delivered to you through uncontrolled prana. If a prana is under control, he infers here, then it's a different matter, isn't it? Because then you're storing it up, and you store up prana, then shakti will come into the picture and she'll come up the spine. That's called kundalini. But without the prana stored up and some power in you, you don't see people have much spiritual power, do you? So when you meet somebody with spiritual power, you're seeing somebody who has mastered the prana, stored it up, and there's a great force coming up into them, up the 7 chakras, as it were. That shakti has awakened in them. So it's what Sri Ramakrishna said, there will be no spiritual awakening without kundalini shakti. There will be no spiritual awakening without her. And so if prana ties to her, you get a hold of the prana and store it up. First as your body's health, mukhya prana. Then finally is the prana that you get from food that delivers energy to the senses and to the body. Finally as psychic prana in your mind, which we're headed towards. We'll get there. But this is all what happens in just 2 sentences that Ram delivers to this court. You see how powerful it is. So these seeds that are lying fallow in the mind he's talking about from previous existences, their precious life force constantly runs, then stops, like water dripping off a lotus leaf after a heavy rain. Worse yet, the discrimination and jnana wisdom that proceeds from the sublimation of one's precious spiritual energy in life, what to do and what not to do, what to eat, what not to eat, how to act, how not to act, what to seek, what to avoid, ceases to exude its saving graces on life and mind, and wanes considerably, soon to disappear altogether. So he makes a statement, then he gives some powerful reasoning behind it. It's this prana can't be called Brahman because it runs and stops. It moves and then it crystallizes. And especially until it's stored up, it cannot deliver higher states of mind. And so people are confused by the stoppage of prana, so that they don't know what to do, what not to do, what to eat, what not to eat, how to act, how not to act, and what to seek and what to avoid. Beautifully put by the young man. Yet, he says, irony of ironies, right in front of their eyes, beings see wise ones acting as examples, ceaselessly inquiring into the nature of their self, and acquiring non-dual wisdom as a result. Like we saw Swami Vivekananda in this day and age. Which is itself a powerful medicine for resisting the onslaughts of disease, as well as an all-around panacea for all that presently ails one. That non-dual wisdom is what he's talking about. Just look at their condition. To those with a weak and uncontrolled mind and body, stripped of prana and riddled with oncoming illnesses due to lack of proper discrimination, learning becomes an aversion. The seeking after Atmagyan is a pain they shun, and the mind itself is a constant weight they would not bear. I can see no sense in this, he concludes. So he gives some very powerful reasoning there, shows he's a great soul, the greatest of souls really, even though he's in a 14-year-old body, and he's coming out with all this wisdom, and he puts it in such an order that he makes the statement about the particular facet of Maya or existence, shows you how people fall into the problem of attachment to it or under its influence. And then he takes it apart with reasoning that shows you what's to be sought after and what's to be avoided. And finally, voices his utter amazement that people won't follow his words. They won't follow the words of the wise, that appear as examples and ceaselessly inquire into the nature of their own self and get non-dual wisdom as a result. So it's very powerfully put in just one paragraph. That's why we like to read the scriptures, think on them very deeply. So there we have fulfilled what he said to the court of the king and all his gathered people there. And let's look then at prana in terms of where he left us. That's the psychic prana. See what the Upanishads say about it first. You can see this chart then, basically an overview of the chart. Well, I'll give you that first, but let's see what prana, how precious and powerful prana is to people of that day and age. That is, the Taittiriya Upanishad was written by these great souls. It states, the progeny of wise parents who know the prana never perish. They become immortal and attain eternal existence, having known the origin of prana, its advent, place, all pervasiveness, its fivefold distributions, and its internal aspect. So we're about to look at its internal aspect here. I already told you a little bit about the prana in food, the prana in the senses, the prana that moves your hand, your arm. Now we're talking about the prana that moves the thoughts, that moves all of that. So the Upanishad states, and these are wise parents who are writing this Upanishad, and they are giving the teaching on prana to their offspring, which is the first sentence there. So they say finally, they don't just leave prana as some force flowing through things. They pray to her. She's a goddess. O prana, make propitious that body of life force, which resides in speech, in the ear, in the eye, and which also pervades the mind. Never depart from us. So we want to espy that prana moving in everything, because when Swamiji came here, he said they don't know anything about prana or the subtle senses, the tanmatras yet here in this country, this time. They don't know about it. Prana and tanmatras are two specific Sanskrit words he mentioned that were missing in our cosmology, what cosmology we had, and weren't mentioned in our religion either, except sort of out of hand, like I like to say. Man does not live by bread alone. I think that's a statement on prana. Or people should look to not just the taste of food and enjoy it, because the prana weren't there. They wouldn't be enjoying the taste. They wouldn't be having the taste. And the food wouldn't even be there to taste, because that's grown by prana in the soil too. That comes from the sun and so forth. So without all these connections, even on the very physical nature of our existence, the prana somehow disappeared to us, knowledge and wisdom of this. So now we have to bring it back. So how do we bring it back? There at the bottom, first we have to say, there are 5 pranas, but there's only one prana. That is, one prana in 5 forms. That's called prana and apana, samana and viana, and Udana. Udana is a very special kind of prana, but let's look at Apana first. Prana and Apana on the left-hand side at the bottom of the chart. So you can see there it's listed as inhalation. Now before you just think it's something that has to do with the breath alone, let's look at the psychic prana on the upper left above the goddess's head. You can see there psychic prana is the imbibing of wisdom. So there's a power in you, a prana, a subtle prana, a psychic prana, which Vivekananda talked about, that actually, if it's on and working, helps you imbibe wisdom. We could now go to some of the stories of Sri Ramakrishna and so forth, where people sitting listening, they leave the room, they don't remember anything. They heard everything that he said in their ears, but somehow their ears, the prana in their ears wasn't working to take it to the psychic prana in their heads to help them digest it, you see. Peas and corn get stuck in the crop of the pigeon and don't go to the stomach to get digested. He had an experience of that once by picking up a pigeon and feeling its crop, you see. So he likened that to this wisdom getting heard by the ears, so the outer prana must be working. But it's not connecting to the inner prana, which is the psychic prana. So this follows the non-dual way of thinking. You think, oh, prana, well, they're praying to her here. Never depart from us. Help us connect everything. But let's put it this way: if you've got a breathing exercise, which prana is famous for, and they're telling you to breathe in, then what do the advices tell you to think when you breathe in? I am Brahman. What is Brahman? Satchidananda. What is that? Bliss, existence, and what was that? Knowledge. So I am imbibing knowledge when I breathe in, my own knowledge. Everything out here is an aspect of my own knowledge. When I breathe in, I'm taking account of it. And then I hold it, and then I breathe out. Well, that's where the expelling prana, you see down below, apana is exhalation. Well, that's not enough for us. See, we know, some of us know about the 5 pranas and just leave it at that. We're trying to connect this to the psychic prana. So how do we connect that to the psychic prana? That we dispel all negativities when we breathe out. Now, this is a matter of connecting your lungs and your breath to your mind. We just had a series before this one called Manaha Prana Sambandha, how to connect the living prana to the illumined mind. So obviously, many of us aren't doing that. There's granthis or blockages in these avenues inside that lead, help us understand where these pranas originate. What was that again? They who know the origin of prana, its advent, how it comes, its all-pervasiveness, and its 5-fold distributions, which I'm talking about right now, and its internal aspect, the psychic prana. They become immortal and attain eternal existence. I took the sentence backwards. So basically, this is how you would sit and meditate the way the Father Yoga wants you to do on earth, water, fire, air, and ether. But then the next step would be to reach your psychic pancha prana, the 5 psychic pranas, and connect them to your lower pranas that you heard about when you were attending your Yoga 101 classes. Now you're getting to Vedanta. Now you're getting into the properties of the mind, which are based in psychic prana. So basically you see here that 2 of them have been looked at already. There's an exhalation and there's an inhalation, prana and apana. You have to connect those to the mind when you imbibe wisdom, when you take in thought, and you expel all the ignorance that is with it when you breathe out. So these 2 pranas in your mind, psychic pranas, are helping you to imbibe wisdom and thin it out of all its ignorance that came with it. Remember, if you have a fire blower, one Upanishad says, and you go to the slopes, and you want just the ore, you don't want all the other stuff that's with it. You take a fire blower and you blow below the slope, you see. And that'll burn everything away, but just the ore, and then you gather up the ore. That's actually an analogy they use in the Upanishads. That is exactly to do with this. You use this psychic prana and its connections to burn everything away, all the negativities from the knowledge you take in. So you can have gold, but it might not be that pure gold. It's got dross in it, so you heat it up. So in that same way, if you do take in knowledge from out here, and some of it's beneficial and some of it's dross, you need something to burn it and to expel it, so that you only keep the essence. We're just talking about illumined souls here who only take the essence from something and leave the non-essence behind. This is what they do when they have control over the psychic prana. Like Sri Ramakrishna is saying, the Hamsa, the swan, the story is that it can take in from a little bowl of milk there, take in just the cream and leave the 2%, as it were, behind. It just takes the cream out of the whole milk and leaves the water behind. So it only takes the essence of a thing. So that's what these souls do when they have mastery of cyclic prana. Now, moving on to the other side of these pranas, because we heard his diatribe already about it. It's impermanent. It ends in death because the prana stops flowing and deserts the body, so the senses turn off. By the way, they also turn off in dream and deep sleep. So the prana rests like a hawk in its nest when you go into deep sleep. And then it brings everything back when you get to dream and start imagining forms again, envisioning things, and come out into waking state and see everything manifested here in objects. So the prana is resting in the causal state. It begins to enact in the dream state, and then it helps you manifest everything and connect to it in the waking state. So this is how the psychic prana is availing you of the power to hear, taste, touch, hear, and smell the earth, air, fire, water, and ether, that the gross pranas, these 5 that we're looking at, have allowed you to experience. But most people are staying right there only. And some people don't even know about prana. That's what I started out saying. Vivekananda said, they don't know about prana here, life force. What to speak of psychic prana? So on the other side here is Samana and Viana. Samana helps you assimilate. Viana is pervading everything. So those are 2 kinds of gross pranas that are here. Like, say, my food needs to get digested. Well, just let the samana do it, you see, because that's going to assimilate all the nutrients out of your food and send them by way of the Viana and Udana to the various parts of the body, through the nerves, into the organs, into the bloodstream, and so forth. So those pranas are working for people all the time at a very basic level. And so how do we make the most of those then? You can see that Viana, or Samana rather, assimilates means the psychic Samana will then digest that wisdom which the psychic prana imbibes after the psychic apana strips it of its impurities. This is done very well by discrimination in higher souls. But they have mastered these pranas. That's what up here it said. The progeny of 5 persons who know the prana never perishes, they become immortal and attain eternal and pass this on to their children. So they're doing this as a matter of course. So most people out here might just be eating, eliminating, using the energy from food as a matter of course without ever knowing about it, without ever dividing it, without ever taking account of it, without ever then connecting it to the mind, so that the mind and body really don't have a connection. It's just body and brain. But body and mind is different than body and brain. So if you want a mind, if you want to expand your mind's awareness to know Brahman, then you're going to have to use these connections to psychic prana consciously and fuse them together in your meditation, in your studies, and in your actions too, hopefully. So you can see here that psychic Viana permeates thought, whereas the gross Viana is pervasion itself. You see, it pervades everything. There's a prana that stays steady in everything and doesn't move. Sort of like, call it non-dual prana if you want. It's already there in everything, so you can count on that to steady your thoughts, for instance. If you want your thoughts to quit being random and you want them to focus on Brahman, then you get a hold of this psychic Viana and you hold it there like a breathless state. That's why it's all connected, isn't it, breath to prana, because you can suspend your own breath if you want. You can breathe in and out any time you want. You can breathe in slowly for 8 counts or 16 counts if you want. You can breathe out again for 8 to 16 breaths, depending on whether it's a beginning pranayam or an advanced pranayam. And there'll be certain effects to that. But you also need to suspend the breath at some time. And sometimes it will become suspended by itself. That's where you know that this psychic Viana is at work. It's pervading that, it's keeping you alive. And so you don't live by bread alone. You live by the prana that's in the bread. And that's connected to something deeper. He's getting to that. Psychic prana then is a great study that after we take account of the 5 main pranas, we can connect them there. Now look at the left-hand side of the chart. Pancha prana, 1 prana in 5 forms. Then follow the arrow up, connect it to the psychic prana that animates the antakarana. That's the mind. So the brain is the brain. It's just an organ in the body. But the mind is an antakarana. It's fourfold. It's an inner organ. And it's the cause of everything. That's what karana means, cause. And antaha means internal. So the inner cause to everything I've just described, and which is why Ram isn't suffering from his karma, and the people outside are, is that he's got his prana connected to his psychic prana connected to his mind, and he's been like this for lifetimes. Krishna tells that to Arjuna in the Gita, and Krishna is the same soul as Ram, remember, in an earlier age, or a later age. And so Ram has got these connections already at hand, so he's not suffering for his own karma or for the sake of himself, he's suffering for the sake of others. Why aren't you doing what I'm doing? Why haven't you made these connections? Didn't we just read about that in the last chart with Uddalaka? How he transcended suffering. See, this is how he did it, as he stepped on the inward ladder towards a true spiritual life, towards eternal life. Follow the arrow further and you see it connecting to the great secret, or the wonderful mother of the universe called Chit shakti, dynamic power of the absolute, the Chit shakti. She's mentioned in the last sloka of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So this is how prana connects to her. Chit shakti means the intelligence of your thoughts, which is there, but you need to connect these facets to it. Let's look up the right-hand side of the chart as we go deeper into Ram's teaching about prana. You could say that his diatribe here is going out and seeing people suffering because they haven't connected their prana to their breath, and the breath and the prana to their thoughts. Like when you think, it's like waking, you see, and when you stop thinking, it's like dreaming or deep sleep. So your mind has these states it goes through too, just like your lungs and body have 3 states they go through. But the awareness in these souls, like Ram, is focused on the internal causes of these. That's why the antakarana is mentioned here. So if you go up the right-hand side of the chart, when you're talking about these 5 pranas, you're talking about the gross body called stula sharira. So you could walk into the court of King Dasaratha and say stula sharira. Everyone would know what you're talking about. Oh yeah, you mean the gross body. Oh, we know what this is and what it's made of. Then you could say to them, subtle body, sukshma sharira. And oh, you mean the mind and everything that goes on in it, you see. So they're just facile. They know everything in the philosophy in that age. And they've kept in track of all the cosmic principles, the Adidaiva Vidya, the original knowledge, the original philosophy of Samkhya Yoga, Adidaiva Vidya. They've kept track of that. And so when you say these things to them, or better yet, when a guru teaches that to a student, or maybe even better yet, when a parent teaches that to its offspring, then they have memory of it, and it comes swiftly to the surface, and they immediately have understanding. It takes so long for that to happen in other ages. And many people are even averse to it and resisting it. So this is where you talk about having 3 bodies instead of just one. The teaching usually goes, you're not the physical body, you're the Atman. Well, how did I get there, you see, from the physical body? Well, I forgot to tell you, you have a subtle body and a causal body. So this is where they fill in the gaps for you. Subtle body is mind, and then there's a causal body called the karana sharira. That can only be likened to something like deep sleep. It's very hard to explain the causal body, except in terms of seeds, like bijams, great powerful words, or letters. Even letters have mother wisdom in them. And each chakra has a particular letter of power in it, and a particular word that is activated at that chakra to call her attention to the aspiring soul's journey inward. So all of this will take you then through these 3 bodies: gross, stula, subtle, sukshma, and karana, causal. The causal body, then, intellect stops vibrating there. So they'll talk about it in terms of deep sleep. But the seeds are still there. That's what makes it distinct from this higher samadhi that Uddalaka just had. We looked at it the last chart, is that when he went to a certain point, the seeds were still there. And they were calling him back to rebirth in bodies. So he burned those and attained nirvana, and then there were no seeds to call him back. That's why we had on that chart, if you remember, Savikalpa Samadhi and Nirvikalpa Samadhi. There are some souls that can reach Savikalpa Samadhi after their sadhana, and then fall back from that, and that's what Uddalaka was suffering. So he says, nuts to this, nerds, See, I'm going on this time past Savikalpa, and I'm going to have Nirvikalpa. I'm going to burn those seeds, asam pragyata. I'm going to burn out time, kalpa, periods of time. Time's not going to affect me anymore. And in that way you go beyond the causal body. So there are many ways of side-by-side explanations of how these great rishis of India determined what was going on physically, psychically, and spiritually, if you want to put it in terms of these 3 bodies. Otherwise, a few quotes there to finish this off. There's, of course, in back of everything, the single eye of non-duality, which we've been mentioning and inferring in most everything we say here. The quote underneath it is from the Prajna Upanishad, which has some good teachings on prana. It says, that one who knows the imperishable, in which rest the mind, the senses, and the pranas, verily becomes omniscient and enters into all. So that's, again, how important it is to have this knowledge of non-duality. It's where the pranas will lead you inward, past the psychic prana, past the causal body, into this state of non-duality, which is evinced by this Agya chakra here, the Jnana Chakshu, the eye of wisdom, non-duality. And if that's opened, then there's where everything merges. And everything has also come out of that. Because it says here, the prana, the senses, they all rest in that state. So in most instances, if you're fortunate enough to find a study on even the 5 gross pranas, you may get some valuable information. But it's very rare that you'll find these teachings that aren't just inferred in the Upanishads of Vedanta that talk about psychic prana. So it's really no fault of us in America that we've never heard of prana. It's a very subtle subject, and it's been studied only by these great souls who have made these interconnections. And they've studied it even past the external hatha yoga, external body kind of teachings, how to live with a healthy body and so forth, nourish it with good food. All of those things that people are focused on in this day and age, without knowing that the cause of health is really back in the psychic prana and deeper in the mind. That's actually what he's leading us up to here. You can see he's talked about all these problems: false superposition, rude ignorance, desires, and false identification with things that we shouldn't be having. And now he's bringing out the prana, and even in that day and age, saying people aren't aware then of connecting to the psychic prana. And so now we have pointed that out. And let's keep that in mind as we connect it to our next level of teaching, which he goes talking next about the ahamkara. You know what ahamkara is the human ego, which to Sri Ramakrishna is non-threatening if it's ripened. But if the ego isn't ripened by self-surrender, for instance, and by devotions and other means, then it becomes a real problem in people. Problem to themselves, problem to others. And it's very actually apropos that we study prana and ego side by side, because people who are committing vicious acts, their prana is running ragged off and on, and they aren't aware of connecting their gross prana to the psychic prana. If they did, then they'd have this inward turn, you see, that the seers have. But they haven't, so they're focused on external things. So if my ego is focused on external things only, I'm barely aware of the 5 gross pranas. How my food gets digested, how my waste gets eliminated, how my eyes see, how my body is healthy or not, how my breathing is. These are all having to do with the 5 gross pranas. So if the ego is unripe and it lives only in the realm of the 5 gross pranas, that's why it does vicious acts, and why it can't, as he said so nicely here, know the difference between what to do, what not to do, how to act, how not to act, what to seek and what to avoid. And there's even a kind of discrimination that Gaudapada talks about in his Karika on the Mandukya Upanishad, where he talks in that vein. There are certain things to seek and certain things to avoid. And then there are certain things to seek to a certain point, and then there are certain things to master and then avoid. You won't need them anymore. So he talks about 4 different kinds of samadhis, savikalpa samadhis in the Karika, and that's a good connection to make. So if we get into ahamkara here, which Ram is doing to the court, let's see what he says about it as we make this shift halfway down the chart. He says to them, to make matters worse and precarious, there is a terrible enemy lurking in everyone. It's called ahamkara, the ego. It insinuates itself into all matters, all thoughts, and all activities, which then become like flowers, soaping up its devious precipitation. Even if one's acts be good, one's thoughts righteous, and one's rituals well-intentioned, still, if these be associated with the baneful ego at all, they will end up in nothing that is truly beneficial. We see that in rituals of the priest class and activities in religious institutions that are not helping people grow, not going anywhere. This is all associated with this baneful ego, and so it's not ripened, as Sri Ramakrishna would say. So that's a good sentence. Even if one's acts be good, one's thoughts righteous, and one's rituals well-intended, still, if this baneful ego is associated, then these things will end up in nothing truly beneficial. He continues, having seen clearly and directly the deceptively changing face of this ego, I became firmly resolved to renounce it, and even refrained from various karmas. But still it persisted, and so too does the suffering arising from it. The only efficacy for it at all, as far as I can see, is that it points to a higher self, which is independent and ever blissful, which is free of identification with the body-mind mechanism. O noble rishis gathered here, if you can reveal to me that blessed self and liberate me from this ego, my mind will be greatly relieved. So there's an invitation for Vasishtha to come up after the discourse is over and come with me, young man. I'll grant your wish here. I've found a way and several ways to reveal to you that blessed self that will transcend the small self. May we make an offering of the small self into the great self. We chant, right? Om Tachnayo Ravrinni Mahe Gatum Yagyaya Gatum Yena Patai. Let's come along with me, he says to Ram. Let's make this humble offering, because the ego doesn't like humility. Yeah, it's its enemy. If the ego is the enemy to the people, then humility is the enemy to the ego. So come along, let's make a humble offering of this small self into the great self. And then we'll delight in this offering. And we'll revere the Lord and Mother of all sacrifices. So sacrifice is another thing the ego doesn't like. It wants everything for itself, you see. It doesn't want to give away to others. But Ram, thousands of years later, was to say, in the form of Sri Krishna, it's a thief that takes and doesn't give back. And there's no room in this world for a thief, nor in the next world for a thief. So in that way, these teachings are carrying forward this message of lessening the ego. I used to say, thinking of an analogy, if this room were bare, nothing in it whatsoever, and you blew up a huge balloon in it, you couldn't get in. But there's nothing in it, you see. So let's mirror out a balloon, pop it, whatever you need to do, and all of a sudden you can enter the room. The ego is rather like that. It's like this empty thing that just takes up all the space for itself. And there's nothing to it. Sri Ramakrishna used to say it's like an onion. It's all peelings and no core. And then we add to that, it also makes you cry, an onion. So the ego will make people cry, and that's what Ram has seen outside. He's seen people weeping from being under the influence of this unripe ego, and he has great compassion for them. So he says, come on, let's diminish this ego through these practices, and then we'll get rid of all the causes for the ego's presence. Now we've noted what he said. Let's go and look at the ego in some of its most vicious forms in this chart. Now, I put out some teachings called Manasana at one time into a book, because I found out that people were sort of attached a lot to physical asanas. And there was a lot to be desired, pun intended, about just being into asanas only. For instance, without the prana and the breath and connected to the psychic prana and the practices of I am Brahman, I will always be Brahman, I'm not the world, connected to the three types of breath which the pranas operate. All of this, of course, connecting in the philosophy. But when I put out the Manasana book, and it bears positive asanas, some that were healing, and some that were spiritual, and some that were eternal, like Ayamatma Brahmasana. If your mind can take a stance that I am inseparable from Brahman, that Brahman and I are one, and nobody can part us. Nobody can tell me differently. That resolve of oneness that Uddalaka proved by his inward ascension in that chart we just looked at is there. So there's a way of then, as the last chart said, and Ram was asking, show me a way that I can get beyond this problem of the ego and get beyond these problems that come from relativity. And so we'll show you how to adopt this mental asana, which is inviolable. It's constant. It's akhanda. It's without destruction. You take it on, you hold it, and that's your stance for all of eternity. But Ram is, of course, coming from the standpoint of people's mental state of mind that is fattening that ego rather than slimming it down. If we're constantly letting air out of a balloon all the time, or sometimes the balloon will just become flat over time by itself, then that's called a gradual purification. The ego's getting its lessons taught to it. Pretty soon, the Atman will show up behind that ego that deflates, you see. Oh, there's something behind the ego, I see it. So the popping method is one really quick way of doing it. A lot of people couldn't bear that, but just slowly letting out of the air of the ego through these exercises, practices, rituals, and so forth helps. But remember, he's saying those are also risky, the engaging in those kinds of things. So it comes down to this teaching about what kind of postures am I holding in my mind, not just what kind of postures I can put my body into, because that's never gotten anyone enlightened. But these postures that I'm holding in my mind have kept everyone from getting enlightened. See? So if I can redirect the prana, resurrect the memory of my divine self, and then diminish that ego with these practices of my sadhana, then the self should come dancing forward and show itself to me. My true self shall come forward. So these mental postures that bind are a problem for people. And it's a lot of what Sri Ram is seeing in the common people outside of King Dasaratha's castle. Poverty, for instance, is causing people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do if they had enough to eat, good work to do, a practice, a guru, and so forth. Some of this is beginning to get lost, obviously, in the Treta Yuga. It's a good question to ask. If 2/3 of spirituality is still present in the Treta Yuga, when Ram and King Dasaratha are alive, then what is that 1/3 that went away? I'd like to know what that consisted of, because that you'll begin to see in the suffering of the people. That 1/3 that went away in that yuga is in direct association with how people are suffering. And there are people like Vishwamitra and Vasishtha in that age who are not suffering. They're fully enlightened. There are a lot of rishis in that day and age, but only 12 of them knew that Sri Ram was an avatar when he was a teenager. So what happened to that disappearance of that other third of that important spirituality? It began to show up in people's suffering. You can trace it that way. So the way I put it in that book was this way: to take up a posture in the mind In order to master one's awareness and attain to yoga, union with ultimate reality will bring about what has been called by luminaries everywhere as balance of mind, steadiness of mind, equanimity of mind, purity of mind, equipoise, all leading to peace of mind, or the peace that passeth all understanding. So this is all brought about by taking up a posture in the mind. We call that manas, mind, asana, posture. So manasana is what you want. What you're going to get rid of by taking up either a healing or a spiritual or an ultimate posture in the mind is the destruction of these postures that bind. And here you see them strewn out across the page. Of course, there's the Buddha with his back away from the courtesan thinking all these thoughts in wealth, beauty, and luxury that she's enjoying. These thoughts are inhibiting her from moving towards the Buddha, taking refuge at his feet, and getting free of the old problem of pleasure and pain, of gain and loss, of joy and sorrow, of virtue and vice, and of life and death. All of these contrasting pairs of opposites, dvandva, mohena, Krishna calls them in the Bhagavad Gita, the pairs of opposites that delude. Dvandva to mohena, delusion. They delude the mind. So what are some of them? Religion is false, is at the very top of the list. She's obviously not looking in the direction of the Buddha, because the Buddha is pointing out things like, well, let's read them: transcendence, service, selflessness, compassion, forbearance, support, positivity, love of God, spirituality, generosity, humility, universality, wisdom, truth, freedom, equanimity, and sensitivity. These are some of the things that Buddha is evincing by that mudra of perfection he has in his right hand. So she's not looking in that direction. What's keeping her from that is religion is false. And also, therefore, God does not exist. So I don't need to put my mind on that. And maybe worse than that, there is no soul. So why? Because the ego has taken its place. The Atman is the soul in all, the Upanishads tell us, and the Rishis are telling us, the luminaries are telling us that. Atman is in everything. That's the soul, but what has come to take its place is this unripe ego, and it's shutting out the vision of divine awareness to that mind. Probably why? Because it doesn't have its psychic prana moving inwardly. It's not connecting to its gross prana. It's not connected to a healthy body, and so forth. We've been all through this a lot. So all of this is moving backwards into the original cause of things, moving outwards and then needing to move inwards. We call that involution in our tradition. There needs to be an involution to everything that's evolved. Sancharaha, prati sancharaha, Lord Kapila says in the Samkhya Yoga scriptures. Everything that has manifested out, there's an inward movement to it to go back to its source. So everything is that way. Everything insentient, and of course the sentient soul too, playing outwardly, must need to turn and involve itself back to its source, which is that ocean of awareness, full of those things that Lord Buddha is evincing there and thinking. What else is there? Objects can make me happy, lower left-hand side. And that's never true. Only for a small, short amount of time maybe. But then things like boredom with the object, theft of the object, destruction of the object, and other reasons why objects can't make you happy will come upon you, like loss of the object and having to gain it back. I am the body is also another fallacy. when really the healing asana would be I am Atma Brahma, this self is Brahman, not the body, the self is Brahman. And then along with that, the conclusion would be the world is real, and Brahman doesn't even have a place in it because there is no soul and God does not exist. So this is the kind of conundrum that's going on in the head of the man and woman who is caught under the auspice or influence of the unripe ahamkara. And this is why Ram is giving his diatribe on that particular part of the antakarna. Remember, it's part of the fourfold mind. Other things are there which are, and we're talking here about negative asanas, right? Postures that bind in the mind. And the other one is, I only live once. So that's, of course, a very short-sighted view when rebirth should be studied. And we have to know how the transmigrating soul moves into the worlds and how it can move out of the worlds, not only to heaven, to its ancestors, but beyond heaven and its ancestors to the formless state, which is its original state. And I only live once is not going to give you that much time, what to speak of that much depth in your mind, to find out about what causes relativity functioning in Maya that causes suffering due to desires, which gives rise to root ignorance, and then false superimposition. You see how it all backs up on itself and is all connected. The connections you want to make are with the pranas, right? And the body and the mantra and the breath. All of these things are beneficial. These kinds of connections that turn into more of the same Maya, exacerbated Maya, are things that you want to try and avoid. So there are different levels to that thought. I only live once is good if it's your last lifetime. Put that way. I will wear this body for the last time. Who said that? There he is, right there. Lord Buddha said that. I will wear this body for the last time. And another negative manasana there is wealth is the goal of life. Well, she's sitting amongst crowns and jewels and bracelets and rings. So she thinks she's got it best. But of course, the goal of life is jivan mukta, to become a living, liberated soul. Because then you have all wealth in its essential form inside of you. What's outside of you is going to be stolen, lost, lose its value. Again, we could go through it all from both the Vedantic and the Buddhist perspective. But people need to reason for a while to understand that. And we see people reasoning for years and then giving it up. They come to the right conclusions, then they just go back to the world. Jobs, wealth, and so forth. If they reasoned, realized Brahman to be the essence of everything, and then went on working in the world with jobs, great, that's Dharma in action. We wouldn't have any problem. He wouldn't be up there delivering his discourse of divine discontent because people are suffering. He's doing that. The last one there is listed as I seek pleasure. You can see all of these are negative or binding asanas in the mind, postures that bind. So we're looking beyond the physical here and beyond asana to whatever perspective is a good word in English. What perspective am I looking at things? How is my mind attuned or focused into seeing through things that are obviously negative or untrue or unreal or mixed, but to actually honed in on reality itself, on divine reality. So some of the things an ignorant person might say is this: worldly knowledge is best. Matter is all there is. I seek only my own good. I am better than others. Ignorance is bliss. The body's health is paramount. My race is superior to others. Only my religion is true. Of course, in the case of this thought, religion is false, then that one wouldn't even occur. But you can see then how deeply these negative postures can go, even into people who are supposed to be intelligent or supposed to be religious. They still have a very narrow look at things. So these binding postures are still there. And that's why when it comes to Ram, we would sing something to him, because he came and told us this. Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om, Ramanam. Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om, Ramanam. Hari Om, Ramanam. Hari Om, Ramanam. Hari Om. Hari Om Ramanam. Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om Ramanam. Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om Ramanam. Hari Om Ramanam. Hari Om. That's how they sing in India. I heard that first sung in India by a group of some 50 to 100 people sitting in front of an altar. And Sri Ram was on that altar, and they were singing their devotions to him in no uncertain terms. And it's a very beautiful sight to see. And listened to that, committed it to memory, brought it back, and now we sing it for our own SRV artis and pujas, and at satsang too. I think we have enough time maybe to go into one more facet, and I know we've taken a lot of time to go through these first four particularly, and then prana took a little time too. Ahamkara and mind deserve time, but don't worry, we'll catch up when we get to Deha, Jayate, Vardate, and Kama. Those are all just like that. They'll go by as if of little consequence. He has very little to say about body, about infancy, about the desires of youth, and about lust, and the other five passions, or six passions he talks about, centers them around Kama, or lust. So when we get to those, probably next week, they'll go by very quickly, and so we will come to towards the end of this series, and afterwards feel like we've gotten a full education from an avatar who was awakening to this truth himself as a young man, which makes it all the more poignant and all the more valuable, and good for our faith and belief too. So where he goes next here in the remaining time, we might have a little time to talk about mind. It would be good to at least broach the subject. So, and the way I was going to do it was talk about how they think about mind in India. From time out of mind, to use a phrase. And because that phrase, mind-only school, in a more broad way, can pretty much apply to every philosophy in India that knows that everything has come out of the mind by mental projection rather than been created out of nothing, as we sometimes say. In other words, this is where you need to know about these seeds. And nobody's a better authority on seeds maybe than the pumpkin or the watermelon. So that's the backdrop I got to use here. And before I transgress my method and routine here, let's see first what Ram says about mind, because it's very powerful. You need peace of mind first and foremost, Holy Mother said. She also said, take care and be very careful with the mind, my dear. you're going to need it to get to Brahman. In the particular state of things today in your life, the mind is essential to get to Brahman. So it's not something you can just jump over and say, oh, let's just quiet the mind, stop its thoughts, and it's all done. The mind holds all sorts of samskaras, and ignorance is in the mind, negative tendencies are there. So let's let Ram tell us about that in the scripture about manas. He says, and it comes right after the ego. He puts the ego as a part of the mind complex, but right after he talks about ahamkara, which we just heard, he talks right again straight about mind. He says, apart from the ego element, this mind we entertain is another grave matter. Manas, the dual mind, is slung high and low and dragged here and there by a howling host of dualities that never know silence or revolution. This mundane and ordinary mind, if left unpurified by spiritual practice, behaves like a homeless mongrel, wandering here and there, looking for table scraps, tossed out of the door by humble villagers. On the other hand, if any bliss of higher things does come to it, this poor mind falls to hold onto it. This poor mind fails to hold onto it for its own good, like a straw basket which fails to contain water. All the worlds, all objects come from this mind. From heaven to earth to the lower patalas, those are hells, this mind carries us in a matter of seconds, leaving hardly any room for rest in the interim. Wherever the mind is present, there appears the universe, and when it is turned off, like in deep sleep, the universe dissolves. Therefore, I am seriously thinking of late that it should be annihilated, for all that is good and bad, painful and pleasurable, arise from it in repetitive turns and in cycles unending. Oh, that's a beautiful paragraph with several different things to look back on and study. So if you have the story of Sukha in the Prakarana of Yoga Vasishtha, first Prakarana, then you'll be able to look that up and see how he talks about manas, or mind, right after he talks about the ego. So we at least got to read that, and our time has come almost to an end. What I'm going to show you next week then, as we look into mind, body, and then how the body goes through infancy, youth, and by the way, growth, disease, decay, old age, and death. You're going to want to be on hand for that, to hear what Sri Ram says about it. We'll start out then next week with this mind-only school perspective, give us an idea of the cosmic mind for one thing, and also the primal seeds in the seedless state. We talked about deep sleep a few minutes ago. So in that way, maybe to leave us not hanging so much on this topic of the mind, I'll read this first quote on the chart, which will give us a pivotal point to start in with next week, next Sunday. The seers of India have realized that everything in form proceeds from the mind, and this is why they have revealed the singular way leading to its dissolution. Sri Ramakrishna has compared the mind's propensity for production to rice seed strewn across the ground before the rainy season sets in. A riot of growth is the result. But if these seeds are exposed to fire prior to their exposure to soil, their power of germination is destroyed. This fire is the practice of yoga, which renders the mind's proclivity for desire-bound expression nil and void, opening the gate to samadhi. There are many types of seated samadhis, of knowledge, of peace, of bliss, etc., but there is only one kind of unseated samadhi. And that's what we talked about just a few minutes back. So burning the mind's proclivity for desire-based expression opens the gates to samadhi. So we'll see how this happens next week when we pick this up and look at the pumpkin as a result. All these seeds that are in the pumpkin as we cut it in half, and all the cosmic principles and the realms and the beings that inhabit the realms moving inward to the seedless state, which we talked about as Sushupti in Advaita Vedanta teachings. You can see the seedless state there has been likened also to asampragyata, because that means seedless. Means no thoughts in the mind that can produce births anymore, if you're wondering what that analogy means about burning the seeds in the mind so that no more germination happens. Then it doesn't need to produce bodies anymore. It just remains in its blissful non-dual state. In other words, they're compared to the same satori, nirvikalpa samadhi, nirvana. This is the opening of the gate to these higher and greater states of awareness, which all beings have as their essence, and which they should move towards experiencing, not just in deep sleep, because a veil keeps you in deep sleep from realizing and seeing this and knowing it and bringing it back to the waking state, as is obvious by looking around. But everyone has that very deep state of formless, vibrationless consciousness called deep sleep when they sleep at night. Otherwise, as Gaudapada says, they turn into nervous wrecks, which was one of the first times we ever heard that expression and rendered it into English. So all salutations to Ram and to all beings, and may these teachings reach them in the form of scriptures and music. Adaram maduram, vadanam maduram, dayanam maduram, hasitam maduram, hridayam maduram, gamanam maduram, maduraripate, rakilam maduram. Vachanam maduram, charitam maduram, vasanam maduram, valitam maduram, jalitam maduram, brahmitam maduram, maduraripate, akila maduram. Om Tachnaya Vrinnimahe Gatum Yogyaya Gatum Yena Pataye Daivi Swastarastu Naha Swastir Manusebhyaha Urdvam Jagatu Besajam Sangnoastu Dvipade Sangchachushpate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Come, let's make a deep and humble offering of the small self into the large self, into the great self. May we always delight in this offering and worship the Lord and Mother of all sacrifices. May peace then come to the entire race. May healing and well-being then abide among us. Om peace, peace, peace. Peace be unto us, peace be unto all. Om Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om Tat Sat.